right. So Boroditsky does a great job explaining and giving us examples of something that is quite difficult to comprehend, especially in the terms that the linguists give us. She's talking to us about the notion of linguistic relativity. And as she says, this is a very old debate. To what extent does language shape our thoughts and actions, or even maybe determine some of them? The concept of linguistic relativity derives from how the signifiers are arbitrary. Let's say there's no necessary reason we call that a desk or a table versus a mesa. As we saw, there's no necessary reason why in some languages that might be a object that gets tagged as masculine or male noun form, and in other languages it gets tagged as feminine. It's entirely up to the language and the people that agree on these words what they should mean. But if the signifiers, the stuff that we use to sign things, the sign language we use, is arbitrary, in some ways the signifieds are also arbitrary, in the sense that I can cut up reality in different ways. So with the color blue, for example, we have light blue and dark blue, but for other people might be two different kinds of colors. So where you draw a line, or if I group together chairs and desks into the same word group, that might be different in another language. Again, male and female categories. These things are in some ways, it's how it shapes our view of the world. The way in which we see the world and perceive the world, and the way in which we take action is guided by our thoughts. That is to say, our signifiers, language that we use, our sign system, changes our perceptions of the signified, the stuff out there in the world, the things we might want to talk about. The question has always been, how much does it do this? And if you're all speaking in one language, can you think the same things as people who speak in other languages? What about people who speak more than one language? What does that do? Boroditsky says, quoting Charlemagne, the person who speaks two languages has another soul, another form of living. I want to go through a couple examples that they talk about in the textbook of how this works. They discuss the example of evidentiality. What's your evidence? Which is a long way of saying, how do you know what you're saying? What is your source? When you tell me that Harry is chopping wood, as the example they give you, how do you know that? This is from a Native American language in Northern California. It has different grammatical forms in which you have to specify how you know that Harry is chopping wood. Did you see it yourself? Did you hear it? Are you assuming it based on something else that you heard? Or did somebody just tell you about it? Some languages require you to specify your evidence in the grammar itself, in what you're saying. Notably, how much evidentiality do we have in English? We can say Harry is chopping wood, and I have no obligation to tell you how I know that. I can use constructions of evidentiality in English, but it is not forced upon me by the grammar. I can say whatever I want. I can make whatever claim I want. Your textbook says that this might be why misinformation or disinformation can spread so quickly in English, because I don't have to cite my sources. In this language, you have to cite your sources in the grammar itself. You have to specify how you know different things. Boroditsky and others give the example of numbers and whether or not a language has more words for numbers than just one, two, and many, which some languages don't have a lot of counting words, don't feel like they need them. I want to talk about this a little bit more than what Boroditsky says and a little bit more than what your textbook says, because I have a little bit of a problem with how this is described in terms of the idea that the people who have one, two, and many don't do math. Well, first of all, say, where do we use numbers the most in our daily life? Are we counting ducks and penguins and stuff like that?
Prices of items.
Most of the time, we're using numbers to buy things or spend money. And if you think about what makes us so unequal as a society, that certain people have money and certain people don't, and you think about societies that don't bother to count such things, I'm just going to take a guess that there is probably less inequality in such societies because you don't have to worry how many ducks you have in your pocket to afford 3 candy bars. Doesn't matter as much. I will also say that this idea that you need algebra or calculus to build this building is probably true, but it is also true that this building is probably going to crumble to the ground not too long from now. Whereas some of the most beautiful architecture that we go to see other places in the world, the pyramids, the Inca structures that are still survived all those earthquakes and Peru, were done by people who did not have calculus or algebra, may not have had many counting terms. So I'd be careful about this idea that we get great architecture because of our algebra. Another point here is that counting words are very easily adopted from language to language. A lot of people who may not have counting words in their own language just borrow some from a different language and add them into their own. Not hard to do. Another point here, which is pretty basic to our understanding, although it's difficult for us Americans, US Americans, to understand this because we are so monolingual. We really like people to speak only one language, and every so often we'll let them add on one in school. But the truth of the matter is, if you look around the world, especially in the past, but in most places today, most people in the world grow up speaking different languages. That's just part of their life. You might grow up speaking 3 or 4 languages in part of your daily life. We have to remember that language influences, but does not control or restrict our thinking. We don't have to be sad for the people who speak a language that doesn't have counting terms, because there's ways that if they want to count, they can do it, and they'll be fine. And there's also ways in which our own language may guide us in a certain direction, but that doesn't mean we can't change it or we can't change our way of thinking. As Boroditsky reminds us at the end of the video, the point is to ask why I think the things I do and to question what kinds of thoughts we have and how people create meaning, which is the title of the next section and the last section of this chapter, 7.4, how people create meaning. We've been talking about things like desks and tables and color blue and numbers and things like that, but we also do this with each other. That is to say, how we think of the person who's talking to us, the person who's speaking, shapes the way that we're going to react to them and the way that the groups react, social dynamics. Your textbook gives you a really interesting example called the McGurk effect. McGurk effect is how people hear something different based on what they think the speaker or what the speaker looks like. They did these matched guys experiments where they had a recorded lecture and then they put up 2 different faces. So in one classroom, they'd have the same recorded lecture and you'd see a white woman face. And in another classroom, you'd have the same lecture, but a South Asian face. And what was interesting is that although it was the same words, the people who were seeing one version scored differently on the exam and thought they heard an accent. Again, it was the same exact lecture, just a different face. This is personally interesting to me because my wife is a Korean ancestry, was born in Queens, grew up in the New York City area, whereas I grew up in Montana. My English is weird and accented, especially out here. Hers is perfect in New York, New Jersey style, which is better for the East Coast. However, when she's teaching a class, every so often somebody will be like, "Where are you from?" As if they just dropped in from another country. Whereas I'm rarely asked where am I from. So you have to be careful of this when you're evaluating people. If you have multilingual exposure, it seems like as a student or as a person, if you are exposed to different languages and different kinds of people, you can adjust your perception and you can learn more if you're exposed to different languages. There's a whole study that derives from this known as Raciolinguistics, which is how people are perceived differently based on how they speak, or people hear speech differences based on how they perceive a person. This has this in our society because we have created these social racial divisions. There are these ideas about that mainstream white American English should be the standard, and that if you speak a slightly different form of English, then it's not quite up to par. Raciolinguistics studies how these differences come about or are produced in terms of expressed in language. And there's a really interesting example in the textbook of they call linguistic prejudice, and they use the example of Disney films, but I would say this extend to others, where the heroes, the good guys, and this is hopefully changing, but certainly back in the day when I was growing up, this was true. The heroes speak mainstream white American English, and the bad guys, the villains, speak an accented or non-standard variety of English. If you're a kid growing up and you've exposed your kids to this, you learn or you're taught, you can unlearn this, but the guiding thing is that the people who speak mainstream white American English are good, those other people are bad. What they're trying to describe here is the mainstream social structure that people have often in this country grown up with. It doesn't apply to everybody, obviously, but that's exactly what people are trying to critique or change so that more people will be able to grow up with less linguistic prejudice. People who grow up in multilingual environments are often able to do something we call code switching. And we all do this to a certain extent. So the way I'm speaking now is not going to be the way I'm talking in my family or in a different or with my friends. This is classroom language. But code switching means you can move between two or more language varieties. We talked about varieties of Black English, for example. Some people are able to maneuver between standard English or mainstream white American English and Black English. Interestingly, there was at the end of this chapter, they give you the example of linguistic profiling, in which somebody who was very good at code switching would it call up the same person and would ask about a job or ask about a loan. And it turns out that oftentimes people will try to figure out who you are and try to change their approach based on how you use language. So, in terms of what he was doing, which was talking to the people who were making loans or renting out a place, he'd call up in one variety of English and they'd be like, "Oh, yeah, you should apply for that job." But if you switch to another variety of English, they'd be like, "Yeah, we don't have no work here." Or the rental price would go up based on which variety of English you're speaking. So again, this may not be your experience, and I hope it isn't, but it's something to keep your eye on because it does happen.